The glow of the laptop screen rested on my face like a pale lamp, and in that quiet pool of light I felt the weight of years pressing against my chest. I remembered the way my father's voice cut through me sharp as a scalpel when he said I was too poor to carry the family name. I remembered the look in my mother's eyes, cold and satisfied, when she reminded me that their practice was not meant for someone like me. In the silence of that room, I could almost hear the echoes of dinners where I sat invisible, where laughter rolled past me as if I were nothing but furniture. I thought of nights spent stitching together shifts at the hospital cafeteria, counting coins for books, pretending it was enough. My heart beat slow, deliberate, and I wondered if survival had made me smaller or stronger. The cursor blinked steady on the screen, a rhythm against my hesitation. I held my breath and let the question surface, fragile and bare. Was there ever a moment when I was truly theirs? I grew up in a house that smelled of antiseptic and polished wood, a house where walls were lined with framed diplomas that did not belong to me. My parents carried themselves like royalty in white coats, their voices always commanding, their footsteps echoing authority. I was the child who lingered at the edge of the dinner table, filling glasses with water, listening to them praise my older brother for his surgical precision and my sister for her quick rise in pediatrics. When it was my turn to speak, my words seemed to dissolve before reaching their ears. I wanted so badly to be part of their world, to wear the white coat that seemed to grant belonging. As a child, I would press my face to the glass doors of their clinic, watching patients nod respectfully, watching my parents move with practiced grace. My chest would swell with pride and then just as quickly deflate when a nurse pushed me aside, whispering that I shouldn't disturb important work. I held on to hope anyway. I studied late into the night, tracing diagrams until my eyes blurred, believing that if I proved myself enough, their eyes would finally rest on me. I remember the day the acceptance letter came. The envelope trembled in my hands as I ran into the kitchen, cheeks flushed with excitement, waiting for applause, waiting for even a small smile. My father lifted the paper, scanned the words, and set it down like it meant nothing. "Medical school accepts plenty," he said flatly. My mother didn't even look up from the pot she was stirring. My brother chuckled, murmuring that luck sometimes favors the undeserving. I laughed weakly as if it didn't matter, but inside I felt the sharp crack of something breaking. Still, I didn't let go of hope. I believed the first step was enough, that once they saw me in the same halls, in the same lecture rooms, they would understand I belonged. I imagined returning home in my own coat, stethoscope shining around my neck, hearing them introduce me as their daughter, the doctor. That dream carried me even as reality frayed it day by day. They invited me to their practice dinners, but left me seated at the far end, my voice drowned by wine and laughter. They spoke of their legacy with pride, and my name was absent. I swallowed the sting and told myself it was only temporary, that once I stood before patients with steady hands, once I proved I could heal, they would see me not as the forgotten child, but as one of them. The first crack in my fragile hope came sooner than I expected. It was the summer before my second year, and I had been working endless hours balancing labs with a part-time job in the library to cover supplies. My classmates were exhausted too, but many of them had parents wiring money, easing the strain. I had only myself. Still, I thought my perseverance might be enough to shift my parents' gaze. I remember standing in the hallway of their practice, clutching my papers, trembling, as I asked if I might shadow them during my break. My father's brow tightened as though I had insulted him. My mother gave a short laugh, the kind that stung more than words. "You don't fit here," she said, smoothing the sleeve of her blouse. "Our patients expect a certain standard. You're too poor to be part of this." The words sliced through me, echoing against the sterile white walls. I stood frozen, my knuckles pale around the folder I carried. My brother passed by and smirked, whispering that maybe I should try volunteering at a clinic that took charity cases. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving me stranded in the corridor with my pride unraveling. I walked out into the heat of the afternoon, the pavement shimmering, the sound of traffic muffled beneath the roar in my ears. It was the first time I allowed myself to wonder if their rejection was permanent. For days, I replayed the scene, the curve of my mother's smile, the dismissive shrug of my father's shoulders. Each time, it hollowed me out further until I began to believe maybe they were right. At night, I lay on my narrow dorm bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow circles, asking myself if poverty clung to me like a stain that even knowledge couldn't wash away. I tried to bury the shame in work. I took extra shifts at the student center, scrubbed tables until my fingers cracked, counted crumpled bills under flickering lights. In class, I forced myself to raise my hand to answer questions clearly, even when my voice shook. Professors praised me for determination, for precision, and yet inside, I felt like an imposter carrying wounds no one else could see. One evening after a particularly long day, I received a call from home. For a fleeting moment, I thought perhaps they had changed their minds, that maybe pride had softened them. Instead, my father's voice filled the line sharp and clipped, asking me not to mention my studies to a distant relative who was visiting. "It's not something we advertise," he said. My stomach clenched. I murmured agreement, though my throat ached. When the call ended, I sat in the dark, listening to my own breathing, and realized I was invisible even in the story of my own family. The months blurred into a rhythm of hunger and fatigue. I lived on instant noodles and coffee, stretching each dollar, stitching my future together with threads that seemed ready to snap. When my shoes wore thin, I patched them with tape. When I grew ill, I swallowed medicine sparingly, calculating whether I could afford another bottle. And still, through every ache, I carried the image of myself standing tall one day, showing them I belonged. But each visit home reopened the wound. At Thanksgiving, the table was bright with food and laughter, yet every compliment drifted toward my siblings. My brother spoke of his research, my sister of her rising reputation. I waited for a chance to speak, but silence pressed heavy on my chest. I lifted my fork mechanically, tasting nothing. When I finally found courage to mention a patient I had assisted, my father's hand slammed the table lightly. "Don't exaggerate," he said. "You're still learning. Don't embarrass us." My sister giggled, brushing hair from her shoulder, as though the comment were amusing. Heat rose in my cheeks. I excused myself to the kitchen, staring at my reflection in the microwave door, wondering why I kept expecting more. That night, alone in the guest room, I pressed my fists against my eyes until the darkness pulsed. I had never felt so utterly small. The rejection became a shadow that followed me everywhere. In lectures, when classmates spoke of supportive families, I sat silent, pretending to take notes. At social events, when they introduced me to their parents, smiling and proud, I smiled back, but felt the ache of absence. My world shrank to books and patience, and the narrow hope that if I built enough skill, respect would come from somewhere else. One winter evening, after an exhausting shift, I returned to my apartment to find the heat broken. The air was icy, my breath visible as I sat on the bed. I pulled a thin blanket around my shoulders, opened my anatomy text, and studied by the dim glow of a desk lamp. My fingers stiffened, yet I turned the pages, refusing to surrender. Tears blurred the print, but I kept going. It was in that moment I realized my determination was not for them anymore. It was for me. Still, the pain lingered. Each time my phone lit with a family number, my heart leapt, hoping for recognition. Each time it ended with indifference or silence. My classmates invited their parents to ceremonies, photographs framed with smiling faces. I stood alone at the edge, clutching my certificate, telling myself the paper mattered more than applause. Yet even as I whispered reassurance, the void grew. There were nights I wanted to quit, to let the rejection consume me. But something deeper pulled me forward, something I couldn't name then, perhaps a stubborn refusal to let their voices define me. The wound became both burden and fuel. I began to see patients differently, to notice the forgotten ones sitting quietly in crowded waiting rooms. Their eyes mirrored my own longing to be seen. I lingered with them, longer, listened more intently, offered what little comfort I could. In their gratitude, I found fragments of worth that my family withheld. The journey was far from over, but I had stepped into a new understanding. Belonging was not a gift my parents could give or deny. It was something I had to carve from stone, even if my hands bled. And so I carried on, heart bruised, but steady, unaware that the years ahead would twist this pain into something far greater than I could imagine. The day I received my medical license should have been the turning point, the moment when every sacrifice was acknowledged. I stood in front of the mirror that morning, the paper still crisp in my hands, and whispered aloud that I had made it. My reflection looked back at me with tired eyes, circles etched deep, but behind them a flicker of pride I had not seen before. I traveled home that weekend carrying the news like a lantern I wanted to share. The house was the same walls crowded with framed photographs of my siblings, their accomplishments displayed like trophies. My certificate felt fragile in comparison, folded neatly in my bag. At dinner, I cleared my throat and announced softly that I had passed. For a brief second, silence fell over the table, and I imagined smiles, imagined words of recognition. Instead, my brother raised his glass with a smirk. "Every hospital has interns," he said. My father's gaze remained fixed on his plate. My mother dabbed her lips with a napkin and reminded everyone of an upcoming gala they would attend as a family. The moment passed, swallowed whole. I sat still, my pulse drumming in my ears. Later that night, I tried once more. I asked directly if I might now join their practice, contribute, stand beside them in their legacy. My father leaned back, arms crossed, and shook his head. "Our patients expect refinement," he said. "You don't carry the right image. You've lived too poorly, worked in places that stain reputation. We cannot have that attached to us." My mother nodded faintly, as though the verdict was final. My throat tightened. I felt words bubbling up, pleas, arguments, but they died before leaving my lips. Their decision was not about medicine. It was about status, appearances, wealth. I walked out of that room carrying a weight heavier than textbooks ever were. The sting of rejection carved deeper than before. On the porch, I inhaled the cold night air, staring at the empty sky, asking myself why love had conditions in this house. Inside, laughter resumed, muffled by the walls. I stood outside for a long time, listening to it, realizing it would never include me. That night became a scar etched across my memory, the moment when hope collapsed into silence, when I began to understand I would never be enough for them no matter how high I climbed. I carried that scar with me into every hallway I walked, every ward I stepped into. The words "too poor" followed me like a shadow, whispering even when no one spoke. But silence has its own way of shaping a person. Instead of letting it hollow me out completely, I turned it into fuel. I took assignments no one else wanted. I stayed through the night in understaffed clinics where the paint peeled and the lights flickered. I stitched wounds of men who worked double shifts in factories, soothed children burning with fever whose parents had no insurance. I listened to elderly women whisper about loneliness while I changed their bandages. None of it was glamorous. None of it carried the sheen of prestige my family worshipped, but in those dimly lit rooms, I felt something stir, an understanding that dignity was not measured in wealth, but in presence. There were nights I fell asleep in the on-call room with my head against a stack of charts, waking to the buzz of pagers and the smell of disinfectant. I often thought of my siblings dining at galas while I reheated soup from a vending machine, but I held on to the quiet knowledge that I was building something real. The path hardened me. Rejection turned into a discipline, a refusal to give up. Each insult became another brick in the foundation I laid for myself. When supervisors noticed my persistence, they offered me opportunities. I took them without hesitation, even when fear threatened to paralyze me. I worked in rural towns where storms cut power and we operated by lantern light. I learned to improvise, to trust instinct when resources failed. Patients remembered me, their letters arriving months later with shaky handwriting thanking me for kindness in a world that rarely spared it. Those words became my fuel when family silence grew louder. Years passed in a blur of long nights and endless shifts. My hands grew steadier, my mind sharper, yet each visit home reopened the wound. My father once remarked casually in front of neighbors that I was trying her best, but not quite there. My mother redirected conversations toward my brother's achievements. I smiled through it, excusing myself early, and drove back to my small apartment with the taste of bitterness lingering. Alone, I sat at my kitchen table, bills spread like cards, and whispered to myself that I was not small. I clung to that whisper until it became truth. Slowly, opportunities grew. A mentor suggested I apply for grants to expand services in underfunded areas. I wrote proposals late into the night, fueled by coffee and stubborn hope. When the funding came through, I managed teams, oversaw clinics, and proved capable of more than survival. Each step was a climb, each triumph carrying the echo of my parents' dismissal, yet I kept moving forward. I never announced milestones to them anymore. Their approval had become irrelevant, even if the wound still throbbed. One day, an investor approached with an idea to buy and revive a struggling hospital on the edge of the city. It was risky, daunting, and bigger than anything I had imagined. My first instinct was fear, the voice of my father whispering that I was unworthy. But another voice rose louder, one carved from years of resistance. I could do this. I gathered every bit of savings, partnered with people who believed in the mission, and signed papers with a trembling hand. The hospital smelled of neglect at first, halls too quiet, paint peeling. But I walked those corridors envisioning what it could become. I spent days negotiating with contractors, nights planning budgets, mornings recruiting doctors who had once felt overlooked like me. Piece by piece, the place transformed. Walls were painted fresh, wards filled with patients, laughter returned to corners where silence had lingered. I poured myself into it, body and soul, until one day I stood in the lobby and realized it was mine. Not a borrowed practice, not a seat reluctantly offered at my family's table, but a home built from rejection and persistence. The first time I signed a document as owner, my hands steadied in a way they never had before. I thought of my parents then, of their words echoing against white walls, and I realized how little they mattered now. The hospital was thriving, the staff loyal, the community grateful. I walked the halls at night, listening to the hum of machines, the steady rhythm of healing, and for the first time I felt whole. Years later, when my parents finally reached out, it was not with pride, but with expectation. They had heard of the hospital's success and invited me to dinner, speaking of legacy and partnership. I sat across from them, calm, watching their practice smiles. They spoke of merging practices, of finally recognizing me. I let them finish sipping water, feeling the weight of silence ready to shift. Then I opened my laptop, the screen bright against the dim restaurant light, and slid it across the table. Their eyes scanned the documents, confusion flickering. My voice was steady. As owner of this hospital, I'm terminating your privileges. The words hung heavy, slicing the air. My mother's hand froze on her glass. My father's face drained of color. My siblings stared as though the ground beneath them had given way. For once the room was quiet, their authority crumbling in seconds. I felt no triumph, no gloating, only release. It was not revenge, it was closure. I had carved my place without them, and now the truth stood undeniable. Their power had never defined me. My own strength had. As I walked out into the night, cool air brushing my skin, I realized the wound they left no longer controlled me. I had rewritten the story, and this time it belonged only to me. When the door closed behind me that night, I did not feel the urge to look back. The restaurant lights spilled onto the pavement, but they no longer anchored me. I inhaled the crisp air, my lungs filling with something cleaner than pride, something closer to freedom. For years I had imagined this moment as a blaze of victory, but what I carried instead was a quiet release. Their stunned faces remained in my mind, not as trophies, but as proof that I had finally stepped outside their shadow. I walked slowly, heels clicking against the sidewalk, and let the silence wrap around me. The world had not shifted, but I had. For the first time I understood that I did not need their recognition. The worth I had sought for so long had been growing in me all along, built from each night I stayed with a frightened patient, from each morning I rose after too little sleep, from every step I took when quitting would have been easier. That was my legacy, not theirs. I returned to the hospital later that evening, choosing to walk the halls in solitude. The machines hummed, nurses moved quietly, and patients slept behind closed doors. I paused outside one room where a child rested after surgery, her small chest rising and falling. Her mother sat beside her, head bowed in exhaustion, but still holding the girl's hand. The sight tightened something in me. This was why I had endured. Not for status, not for applause, but for moments like this, where presence meant survival, where care meant everything. I realized then that my family's rejection had driven me here, to a place where I could create the kind of belonging I never received. Each life touched within these walls was evidence that pain could be turned into something larger than itself. Standing in that hallway, I whispered a promise to myself I would not let bitterness shape me. I would build from grace, not vengeance. Their world had collapsed in seconds, but mine was steady, rooted, and alive. The hospital was more than a building. It was a reflection of every silent struggle I had endured, every scar transformed into strength. I walked back to my office, sat at my desk, and looked out the window at the city lights. My reflection in the glass no longer looked like the girl waiting for approval. She looked like a woman who had claimed her own ground. I pressed my hand to the cool surface and let the final remnants of longing fade. I did not need their table, their practice, or their name. I had my own. The days that followed felt strangely calm, as if the storm I had carried inside me for decades had finally broken and left behind clear skies. I moved through the hospital with lighter steps, greeting staff with genuine ease, no longer haunted by the question of whether I measured up. My office, once a place of late-night doubts and restless pacing, became a quiet sanctuary. I decorated the shelves with letters from patients, photographs of teams I had worked beside, small tokens of gratitude that meant more than any award my family displayed on their walls. Each object was a reminder that value did not need to be bestowed. It could be created, nurtured, and lived. One afternoon, I paused by the lobby, watching families come and go. A man in overalls pushed his wife in a wheelchair, his rough hands gentle as he adjusted her blanket. Two children raced toward the reception desk, their laughter bouncing off the walls. I stood there for a long while, letting the ordinary beauty of these lives wash over me. For years, I had been blind to this kind of richness, chasing recognition that would never come. Now I saw clearly that what I had built was not just a hospital, but a refuge, a place where those overlooked elsewhere could find dignity and care. At night, I wrote in my journal something I had neglected for years. The words flowed without hesitation, sentences filled not with anger, but with clarity. I admitted to myself that I had once been desperate for approval, and that desperation had nearly consumed me. But I also acknowledged the resilience it had sparked, the quiet discipline that had carried me through hunger, fatigue, and loneliness. The pain had been real, but so was the strength it unearthed. Slowly, I learned to forgive, not in the sense of excusing, but in the sense of releasing. My parents' cruelty would always be part of my story, but it would no longer dictate its direction. I let the anger loosen its grip, replacing it with gratitude for the independence I had been forced to claim. I understood now that rejection had been a doorway pushing me toward a life I might never have chosen otherwise. Some evenings I walked the city streets, breathing in the scent of food carts and rain on pavement, feeling more at home than I ever had in the house I grew up in. The world was wide, alive, and open, and I was finally ready to live in it without the constant ache of proving myself. In that space of reflection, I discovered peace. Not the fragile peace of silence, but the durable kind that comes from knowing you have survived, rebuilt, and flourished. I was no longer the girl standing in the hallway of my parents' clinic, waiting for permission to belong. I was the woman who had carved her own place, and that realization filled me with a pride deeper than any applause could offer. Healing did not come in a single moment. It came slowly, like light seeping under a door, filling the room inch by inch until the darkness no longer held power. At first, I did not trust it. I expected the old ache to return, the sting of their words to rise again. But as weeks turned into months, I found myself waking without the familiar weight pressing against my chest. I noticed laughter in small places, the break room, when a nurse told a joke, the lobby, when a child waved at me, the garden outside the hospital where flowers bloomed despite concrete. These details anchored me. They reminded me that joy could live quietly, asking for nothing in return. I began to invest more in friendships, something I had neglected while chasing shadows. Colleagues became confidants, neighbors turned into companions, dinners shared, long walks, taken conversations stretched deep into the night. These were the threads that stitched my heart back together. I no longer measured myself against the family that dismissed me. Instead, I measured life by connection, by kindness, by the freedom of living without constant judgment. In time, I also learned to love myself in ways I once thought impossible. I cooked meals not just for nourishment but for comfort. I filled my apartment with music, let candles burn until the wax pooled, bought flowers for no reason other than beauty. These rituals were small, but they carried meaning. They whispered that I was worth gentleness even from myself. Looking back, I see now that the story was never about revenge or triumph over them. It was about reclaiming the parts of me they tried to silence. It was about walking through fire and realizing I could build something sacred from the ashes. I do not deny the pain. It shaped me, but I no longer bow to it. I stand taller because of it. The lesson is not bitter. It is clear and quiet. Your worth is not for others to decide. No matter who tries to diminish you, you can choose to live fully, to create, to rise. If you have ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told you are not enough, know this: you are more than their words. You are the life. You continue to build the love. You continue to give the strength that carries you forward even when no one applauds. As I close this chapter, I do so with a heart at peace. My family may never change, but I have. I belong to myself now, and that is enough. If you carry a story like mine, let it rest here for a moment. Reflect on it. Share it if you wish. Remember that no matter the rejection, you can return to yourself. The path may be slow, but it leads toward freedom, and freedom is where healing truly begins.